We need a bigger applause than that. Come on. There we go. Woo! We're all gathering in community. Let's celebrate that. Welcome to the Alice Mackay Room at the Vancouver Public Library. My name is Jorge Amigo, and I'm the head of cultural programming for the library. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm going to share that I'm an immigrant from Mexico, which means I'm a settler in these lands, which means that I have a responsibility to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to integrate that into my job as a public servant for your library. So it's great to see you all here tonight for another event in this year's Incite series, which is wonderful, and we are very grateful for the Vancouver Writers Festival to bring some of the best authors to our stage. So thank you to the Writers Festival. Let's give them a hand, please. And today is a particularly important day because we're celebrating International Women's Day. Another round of applause, please, for that. Woo! And so to honor this date, we're here to listen to inspiring stories of women who blaze their own paths in traditionally male-dominated industries. I want to say hi to all the audience at home. This event is being live streamed, so there is an audience at home that is watching this. And before I pass it on to Leslie, I'm going to talk about two very quick housekeeping notes. The first one's really obvious. Please silence your cell phones. All the beeps and dings that come out of your devices can be really distracting, not only for the people on stage, but also for your neighbors. So make sure that you take a moment right now to silence those. And the second thing is we have bathrooms that are located right outside this room. And I'm going to ask you a quick favor. If you want to use the bathroom, please use the door over there in the corner where our friend is standing there. And that means that that door is a little less distracting than this door when you come out. So feel free to come in and out as many times as you want. It's not the opera. It's not the ballet. You can come out and you can come back in. So it's my pleasure now to pass the torch to the Writers Festival. Woo. Yeah.
Thank you, Jorge. Good evening and welcome to Incite. I'm Kylie Schilling. I'm the executive director at the Vancouver Writers Fest. I work with our amazing artistic director, Leslie Hertig, who's here as well. And we are delighted that you could join us here, both in person and at home. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Jorge, for acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Tonight, on International Women's Day, we are really thrilled to be able to host two authors, both of them strong, outspoken, funny women, whose books Chasing Rivers, A Whitewater Life, and Thick Skin, Field Notes from a Sister in the Brotherhood, center a women's perspective as they each unpack the challenges and rewards of being someone who widens the path for women in professions traditionally dominated by men. As a whitewater guide navigating some of the most challenging and remote rafting rivers in North America, Tamar Glouberman takes us on a thrilling, vulnerable journey in her memoir, Chasing Rivers, A Whitewater Life. Traversing the highs and lows of the rapids, this is a story that, as Kelly S. Thompson put it, expertly tackles themes of sexism, mental health, and what it means to trust in yourself in a world that rocks that boat. Our second book, Thick Skin, Field Notes from a Sister in the Brotherhood, is a deep dive into the secret language and hidden culture of one of the most esoteric, heavy construction trades, boilermaking. This one's from Hilary Peach, who worked for over 2 decades as one of the only women in the Boilermakers Union. The stories are a sharply observed recounting of people who are real, who are human, who are sometimes incredibly helpful and generous, and sometimes really the opposite. So we're really excited for this conversation tonight. I want to say great thanks to our Incite event partner, the Vancouver Public Library, for their tremendous collaboration and support. Thanks also to our government sponsors, the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island, who are tremendous supporters of our work. This is our 4th Incite event of the season. We host events here in this very room every other Wednesday night. And we also have a series of special events coming up in May. So definitely stay tuned for those. If you're not on our list, on our email list, you will want to get on it. Soon, I'm going to turn things over to our excellent host this evening, Charmaine De Silva. And Charmaine is going to talk with our two authors for about an hour before turning it over to you, to our audiences here and online for some questions. So you'll have a chance to ask some questions to our authors towards the end. And following their conversation, Hilary and Tamar will be available to sign books right over at the table over there. Thanks to our bookseller partner, Book Warehouse from Black Bond Books. So definitely please support our authors, our local publishers, and our independent booksellers by picking up their books after the event. So I'm going to give the official bios now. And I'm really excited to introduce our moderator tonight, Charmaine De Silva. She is the news director of City News, Vancouver and Calgary, which is one of Canada's most innovative multi-platform newsrooms. She's a 3-time National RTDNA Award winner and a 2-time Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner. She is best known for highlighting gaps in BC's family justice system in a groundbreaking podcast and news series. Charmaine is also a passionate community leader. She has served on the board of the Vancouver Pride Society and is currently working to bring Canada Pride to Vancouver, which is fantastic. Tamar Glouberman has spent much of her life working as an outdoor guide, and that career has given her opportunities to work and travel in amazing places, including the Galapagos, Zambia, and Peru. In spite of those exotic locations, she is most grateful it has also allowed her to enjoy many adventures in remote areas of North America, among the wild rivers and grizzly bears. When she's not off exploring the wilderness, she lives in beautiful Whistler, BC. Tamara is a graduate of the Creative Writing MFA program at UBC, and this adventure memoir, Chasing Rivers, A Whitewater Life, is her first book. Hilary Peach has released 3 audio poetry projects, Poems Only Dogs Can Hear, Suitcase Local, and Dictionary of Snakes, and a collection of poems, Bolt, that was distributed by Anvil Press in 2019. For 20 years, she worked as a welder for the Boilermakers Union, dabbled in blacksmithing, and produced unusual art projects on Gabriola Island. She's now a boiler inspector for the Provincial Safety Authority and is writing a novel. This is going to be a really amazing evening, so please welcome Charmaine, Tamar, and Hilary. Thank you.
You'd think I'd be more comfortable around a microphone, but apparently, well, thank you so much, everybody who's here today and everybody joining us from home. And thank you, Hilary and Tamar. I'm so excited to get a chance to talk with both of you after reading your incredible memoirs. And I wanted to start by saying, there's likely zero chance you'd probably ever catch me out on the Whitewater in a raft. And I know, and my family will say, attest, it's really not a good idea to give me any sort of tool that could do anything, cause damage, hurt, or injure. But I know I felt, and I'm sure many other women reading your memoirs probably felt the same thing, which is a connection to both of your experiences in many ways. And today is International Women's Day. And so I wanted to kick things off by sort of asking each one of you to sort of share a little bit about that journey of entering a field that is heavily male dominated. And I know both of you have connections to your respective industries today, and things may or may not have changed. And so to kick things off for International Women's Day, sort of thoughts on that evolution. I don't know who wants to go first.
Looking at me?
Yeah.
Golly. Well, I went into the trades because I had a theater degree. So it's the old joke about, oh, you're in theater, what restaurant do you work at? And I was really lousy at working in restaurants. So And I did kind of weird theater, like the kind of theater that nobody pays you any money for. And so I really needed a job. So I did a survey course of different trades, and I liked welding. And I just kind of stumbled along step by step like that, and one little bit at a time. So it wasn't planned, you know, I'll tell you that. But that was the main motivation, is that I needed to pay the rent.
It's important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And today, you're obviously you're an inspector. You still sort of touch it. Has the demographics changed at all? You know, you were one of a handful when you started, and now.
When I started with the field local of the Boilermakers Union in BC, I think there were 7 women out of about 800 members, and now I think there's close to 20. They have 2 women per class. They have a couple of women apprentices per class. Things are changing in that way for sure. And now I'm not on the tools anymore. I don't go into those places. I'm an inspector. So there are a few inspectors, but I live in I work for an organization that was very progressive about inclusion and diversity and equity in their hiring policies, and it's made a huge difference.
Fantastic. And you, Tamar?
Well, I'm not going to get into the whole how I got into raft guiding, because it's a large
part of the book.
It's a pretty much a whole chapter in the book. So I'm not going to. But I kind of fell in love with whitewater kayaking, and it was sort of a natural evolution in order to want to stay on the river and whatever to become a guide. And when I started guiding, I worked on the Hudson River, the same Hudson River that goes by New York City, but much further up, where you could actually drink out of the water and do a 17-mile trip without passing any houses or anything. And on that river, it was a very heavily traveled day tripping river. There was days where there was 1,000 people out there, literally, and so there was 100 guides out there. There was over 100 guides that worked on that river. When I started working there was 5 female guides. And but it was an amazing thing, because that was a really long time ago, and I'm still friends with 4 of those women. So not that I dislike the other one, it's just,
I feel like that could be another book, maybe.
But that one. But in any case, yeah, it was. And then I came out to BC, and I had this, what I think was a really awesome life of I'd do springs out on the Hudson, and then once the water started to sort of simmer down, sort of calm down there because in the spring it would be like really wild and exciting, and they started in April, and so I'd work there in April and May, and then I'd drive out to BC when the rivers here were just starting to rise, and I'd do multi-day trips. And the company I worked for the first several years I worked for them, I was the only woman that worked at that company, and we were often like the only people out on the river. Like, we wouldn't see other companies out there. So, it was pretty, I found it that we got into the harder rivers, there was less and less women out there. But now it's changed a lot. There's definitely a lot more women working on rivers now. It's still, I'd say, more men for sure, but they're definitely, on the harder rivers especially, you'll definitely see more men. But it's really awesome to see that women are coming up on those rivers a lot. So that's really awesome.
I just find it so fascinating, because even in my own industry, I work in news, and with the recent passing of Barbara Walters, there's been a lot of conversation about, this industry. And when she started, she was one of the first to do the job. And in newsrooms now, it's the opposite. In fact, it's probably majority women on the ground. In leadership, it's still a minority, I think. But it's just fascinating to hear about the evolutions in different fields. And I think people can identify with that as well. Being International Women's Day, one of the things that I think about as well is that we all started at some point as little girls with hopes and dreams and thoughts and ideas. And when I was a kid, I didn't think I wanted to be a reporter or a journalist. It wasn't even a job I really knew about. But when I look back on myself, there are things that I can identify about qualities I had early on that give a hint or an inkling that I would end up where I am. when you look back on your childhoods and think about these incredible journeys that you've been on, were there any hints with little Hilary and little Tamar about where you would go and what you would do, or did you have different ideas about expectations and things that were, options for us back then?
Well, I mean, when I was a kid, I was kind of scared of everything. So I would say that didn't seem like the natural evolution. In school, I got good marks in most things except for gym class. That was the hardest thing for me. And yeah, I was scared of most things. When I was around 12 years old, my parents took me on a rafting trip. They took me and my sister on a rafting trip, and the whole drive to the river, I thought that I was going to die. I thought this was probably my last day on earth. I just didn't think that I was going to survive this, but clearly I did. So I guess in that ways, it was, I'd say a pretty big surprise that's where things took me. On the other hand, I think about the fact that I always loved being out in nature. We had a cottage, and I just loved being there, and I loved being on the water and in the water. Like I've been swimming since I was 6 months old, and I've always really enjoyed being in the water. So I think that was definitely a hint. And I used to go to summer camp, and in summer camp I loved canoeing. We were on flat water and everything, but I sort of loved having a paddle in my hand, and I eventually became a really big title. I know you're all going to be really impressed, but I was the canoeing director at Camp Canawana.
Wow.
And I know.
It's not in your bio. I'm surprised.
Yeah, I know. I still put it on my resume. I was pretty into canoeing. So I guess, and it's funny because I'll run into people that I knew from camp all these years later, and they're like, "Oh, so you still wear a life jacket all day for your job?" I'm like, "Yep." Things haven't changed, so I guess there was definitely some clues.
The writing was on the wall. Excuse me. Well, I can't say that when I was like 5 or 6 years old that I dreamed of being a Boilermaker or a welder. I didn't even know what that was. I was raised by accountants, and in another part of my family, there's a lot of dentists, but not a lot of welders. Sorry, I've got
Yes.
It's okay. Can I pour you a glass of water?
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar.
I do remember taking things apart when I was small. I couldn't stop taking things apart. My parents had a Big Ben alarm clock. Do you remember those? They were about this big, and they had these big screws on the back with the slotted stainless steel screws, and I just couldn't help myself. I'd take a knife or whatever it was. Thank you so much. I have this thing in my, anyway. So I'd take that apart, and I'd have a little pile of springs and screws and parts, and of course never be able to get it back together. I could kind of get things back in the casing, but it would never work again. So I was very interested in how the world worked, and nobody would really tell me in my family, because we weren't handy people, we weren't sporty people, and I was afraid of everything too. So that's really interesting. But there wasn't a shop. I didn't have like a dad or an uncle in the shop that was always fixing things. So I was all kind of going into it cold, but it was so mysterious. I think it was the mystery that really grabbed me, the mystery and the terror that sort of got me into making things and taking them. Once you take things apart, then you want to know how to put them back together, right?
Yeah. Well,
I was about to say, and your family might want that too. This might be the first time I'm fessing up, but I used to take our old style telephones. I used to take them all apart and try to put them back together. And probably when they didn't work, it might have been my fault. I don't know.
I'm sure we're not. I don't think we're the only ones in this room who did that either.
It's fun to take things apart.
Having read both of your memoirs and incredible journeys, and I enjoyed both of them thoroughly. Definitely some themes that overlapped. But before we get into that, I was hoping to give folks an opportunity to hear a little bit from each of your books. So I don't know if one of you wants to volunteer to go first, but we're going to rock, paper, scissors this, or...
I'm good either way. I don't mind. You want? Go for it. Okay. All right. So I have a bit of a dilemma because I didn't know it was live streamed, and I have a family-friendly version, and the version I was going to pick isn't that family-friendly. So I guess you guys could decide. I think I say a bad word in one version, and I don't say it in the other. So, you want to take a vote? We're adults. Really? Okay.
I mentioned to you earlier, Hilary, like I'm not sure how many kids are watching this.
Yeah,
like I'd
well,
be
there's
very
that.
impressed if
There's
they
that,
are,
right?
but I might. Yes, if they're watching
Well-
this, I think we're good.
Well, I was trying to find a passage. I've been doing some readings lately, and I've been reading the parts from this book that are about relationships, because there are parts in this book that are about technical stuff, because there's kind of a cone of silence in my trade about how to actually weld a pressure joint. It's not written down anywhere. It's all oral tradition. It's like blacksmithing, which is where my trade comes from. So I thought, well, I'm going to weld it. I'm going to write it down, right? I'm actually going to do that. So a lot of it is, but you don't want to hear me read a long passage about how to weld a pressure joint, I'm pretty sure. So I thought what's more interesting for readings is parts about relationships. And so I had lots of relationships with different male partners, work partners. I was a welder, so I always worked with a fitter over the years. But since it was International Women's Day, I have a short part that's about a woman that I worked with. Sorry about the cough candy. So I'm going to read a little piece about her. This was working in Alberta at the lakes, and then I'm going to jump to another part, and it's just from the same story. Excuse me. I'm just going to put that right there. Right, in case I need it. The decades-long shortage of skilled workers in Alberta had opened up room for women in the trades in ways that diversity initiatives and inclusion campaigns never had. There were a lot more women than in BC. My first time at the lakes, there was a fight in the lunchroom because one gal refused to work for another who was assigned as her foreman because they had some bad history. But I found it kind of thrilling to be in a place where there were actually enough women on the job to have a cat fight. At Keep Hills, I was partnered with a woman who was older and tougher than me and into motorcycles, sex, hard drugs, and booze. She lived completely outside my world, and by comparison, I was a nebbish, wide-eyed girl with thick-framed glasses who brought healthy lunches to work. We were each other's opposites. Every encounter felt a little dangerous, but I couldn't help provoking her. "Would you like a vitamin?" I'd ask, shaking the bottle when she had a particularly nauseating hangover. "They're for ladies over 40. "Fuck you," she'd say. One evening, I was late after speeding back from a dental appointment in Edmonton and had been pulled over by the police. The policeman ran my license and, seeing that I had a clean record, let me off with a warning. My work partner had had many less benign run-ins with the cops. "First of all," she said, "who the fuck goes to the dentist when they're travel carding?" "Dental hygiene is very important," I said. "And second, why the fuck would the cop let you off? You just flash them big titties of yours at him and he let you go?" I nodded. "Yeah, pretty much." "So what was your plan B?" she asked. "You start crying?" "I don't know," I said. "I've never needed a plan B." She shook her head. "Sometimes I don't know whether to punch you in the face or hug you. Given the choice," I said, "I think I'd rather you hit me." The road from Wabamun to the power plant crosses Range Road 42 and runs through the Paul First Nation Reserve before hitting Road 627. "Make sure you don't hit a horse," my foreman told me one early morning after work. "What?" "Make sure you don't hit a horse. There are horses everywhere around here, and a lot of them loose on the road. You can get a $10,000 fine and go to jail if you hit a horse on reserve land, so be careful. Watch for horses." "I will," I said. "I don't want to hit a horse." "Nobody wants to hit a horse," he said. I was stopped by animals many times on that job between the power station and the house. There was a beaver slowly lumbering across the road at the railway tracks. A couple of Highland cattle who came looming out of the fog one night. A herd of sheep, a goat, a thin dog that I tried to coax into my car. One morning, driving back at dawn, the truck coming toward me slowed to a stop and flashed his lights. I stopped as well, and we both turned down our headlights. Dawn was breaking, and there was a low mist hanging over the country road. We waited for nearly 20 minutes while two porcupines engaged in a careful courtship ritual in the middle of the road. Nobody wants to hit a horse. I thought about that a lot, about all the navigating that every one of us had to do trying to find our way through tricky situations, trying to survive, trying to succeed, trying to relax, trying to get from point A to point B, and just when you start to believe you are going to make it, suddenly there are wild horses all over the road and you have to drive through the fog trying not to hit one. I felt like that on almost every day of my career. Then very early one morning, just before dawn, just before the hour when porcupines make love, there they were, horses, all along the grassy strip between Range Road 42 and the railway tracks. There were 20 or 30 of them spread out for about a mile, no halters, no shoes, muddy, their manes tangled, their eyes brightly lit with a wild look, wary, looming out of the dark into the headlights. That wasn't.
Thank you.
That wasn't too unfriendly family
No.
fare.
No. As I said before, and I think someone else, if kids are up watching this, they've earned that that passage for sure. Really. Yes, definitely. It's a privilege. Before we go to Tamar, and only because you touched on it in the relationships, one of the things I wanted to ask both of you is, and you both touch on this in your memoirs, is, you know, those relationships, the partners, the mentors, colleagues, and just by the nature of what both of you were doing, a lot of those folks were men, and it's a conversation I've actually had with a lot of, you know, women in industries that might be male dominated, is that role that men can play as allies in careers, and also as not allies and obstacles. And was hoping each of you could sort of touch on that, because that is a theme that comes, you know, up in various times in each of your books. Tamar, did you want to start?
Sure. I'm just sitting here with a whole lot of regret, because I know before we were saying which one of us should go first, and we're both like, oh, I don't care. And now I'm just like, I definitely don't really want to follow that up. But anyhow, it was really great. I definitely have to get past the first chapter of your book now. I feel like I was really lucky, and actually, to be quite honest, continue to be really lucky with that. I did have a couple of female mentors, but most of my mentors in the rafting world were men for sure, especially as I got into harder rivers, and I found, you know, I definitely encountered a little bit of sexism and stuff, but I also encountered an awful lot of people who were very open-minded, that if I really wanted to do this and, you know, showed that I was really into it, people would actually, you know, take me under their wing and help me out. And it was an amazing thing. Like, you know, it's easy to dwell on, like, the people that, like, you know, I walked into this rafting company office once. I was, you know, with my resume, and I had worked on rivers way harder than what they were doing, and I knew they were hiring people, and like they wouldn't even talk to me. Like, you know, they just looked at me and were just like, yeah, you know, 5'2" woman, yeah, that's not what we want. And you know, that was it. But more than that, I had people like be pretty amazing in how they did accept me. And I think about, just bosses that I had that were just like, you know, they put me on the biggest stuff and tell me I could do it. And it was great. I had a lot of encouragement. I had, you know, a lot of the guides that I worked with were really encouraging of me. And I was really lucky in that way. I know not everybody experiences that, but I was very lucky in that way.
I love that. I love that you were lucky in that way, and that you had that experience in your field, because without that, we don't really go anywhere, you know, in a so-called male-dominated industry or trade or field, because there's a point where you can't fly solo, right? So when I started out, people wanted to interview me as the sort of lone woman in the trade, in the heavy trade. There's like the hard trades and the soft trades, so-called. And it would become quickly apparent that what they were interested in wasn't actually what my job was about. Oh, we want to hear about what your job's about. What's it like to work in the trade? So I'd start telling them about doing a heavy lift or, you know, something technical. And they said, no, that's not, we don't want to hear that. That's not what we want to hear. What they really wanted to hear was how I'd suffered, you know, like how sort of terrible it is. Because there's a narrow kind of bandwidth of assumptions which says that women who go into trades have a really terrible time, and men who are in trades are really terrible to the women. But that's actually not true. It's a very, again, narrow bandwidth of men who are hostile. Most of the guys are fantastic. And so all of these fantastic guys who want you to be part of the team are also experiencing a disservice. So as my friend Lindsay said to her, she's an electrician and an instrumentation specialist, and she said, so this toxic masculinity thing isn't working out so well for you either. So with the book, I wanted to write something that showed more respect to women who work in the trades rather than just that one thing that you're, you know, out there alone against this terrible environment. But I also wanted to write a book that showed respect to the men. Because men are incredible, right? And these are human relationships. It's not a stock thing. It's not a pat. And you may tell me, you're in broadcasting and you're in river rafting. I mean, have you experienced, tell me what you think about that, because to me, it's all complex human relationships fitting together, right? It isn't.
Totally.
It isn't just a bias. It's not all bias, right?
Oh yeah, entirely, and not just in like the rafting industry, but we were talking about this a little bit before we came out here about it's not something I talk about all that much, but I did briefly work up in Kitimat on the LNG site, and I was working maintenance, and I was the first woman to work on the maintenance crew, and I was a little bit worried about how the men would treat me there, because it was, it's a totally, I'm out of my element, and definitely I was hired as part of a let's get more women on the site, not because I actually had the experience needed to get a paycheck like that. And I was just like, they're just gonna resent me and whatever. And when I first got there was definitely a little bit of weirdness, but those guys were so welcoming and so willing to share. You hear all this stuff, as you said, about the rough guys in the trades and toxic masculinity and all that. And every single one of the guys that I worked with was willing to share whatever experience they could with me, and just being awesome. And yeah, probably even more so than the rafting industry. But the rafting industry was also great. And I agree with you. In the book, I also wanted to show that it's not like me against the world. It was, the world's not what we think it is in a lot of ways like that. A lot of men are really willing to treat you appropriately and teach you and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I've been really lucky with that. Or maybe I haven't been lucky. Maybe that's just the way the world is. I feel lucky, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like to believe that there's a lot of good out there, and more good out there than bad. And Hilary, it's interesting that you asked, because when I look at my career, I certainly wouldn't be here without the support and encouragement of mentors. Almost all, significant majority have been men. I do have some incredible female mentors, but I think part of it, part of the narrative that sometimes comes up is that, you know, being a trailblazer means that you just face, you know, this nonstop adversity after adversity after adversity. But there are really beautiful, you know, stories about relationships and how they support you. There's also sometimes, I think, something that isn't talked about often enough is in some of those environments where there are few women, sometimes women with each other feel like they're you know, that other woman is your competitor. And so it can often be, you know, the other women around you who are more of an obstacle than some of the men who are there supporting you. And so it's great that we're having these conversations. And I know in almost every industry, there's conversations about diversity, inclusion. How do we make spaces more welcoming? And that means approaching it from all angles, right? And not just one where we paint certain people as bad and other people as good. But yeah, it was interesting to see those beautiful stories about mentorship and support from men because, you know, and maybe I fell victim to it as well. You know, you assume that might not be the case, and certainly was the case for me, and clearly was the case for both of you. Before we dig into the next part, did you, Tamar, want to, we'd love to hear a little excerpt from your lovely memoir as well.
Sure. It took me a while to decide, well, like up until a few minutes ago, what I'm going to read. But you know, I'm still pretty new to readings, and you know, some of the advice I was given was to read stuff with like high stakes and big suspense, and I'm not doing that. So sorry if that's what you're expecting. This isn't even a particularly exciting stretch of river or anything, but being that it's International Women's Day, I wanted to answer a question that I get asked a lot about, like, you know, dealing with men on the river. You know, as a guide, I did sometimes, you know, I was saying like my coworkers and everything were really usually quite welcoming, but I did definitely encounter certainly not the majority of my guests, but it wasn't that unusual to encounter people that were sort of surprised to have a woman as a guide and were kind of maybe a little not that happy with it at first. And I've had a lot of people ask me how I dealt with that. And so I'm going to read you a little excerpt. It's from May 2007, and it was, and it's kind of a nice, I don't know, it's just sort of a fun day on the river thing that was sort of right before a lot of things changed for me. But it was when I was sort of feeling at the top of my game, shall we say. Okay. That Saturday on the Hudson, I'd been assigned to a stag party group of 6. Rafting stags were popular, and my boss had taken to giving me many of them. He'd realized no matter who I had in my boat, I usually ended up telling dirty jokes. The stags were a safer bet for him than the camp and church groups we got so many of, especially since a few of my dirty jokes involved nuns. Some stag days began with the men surprised to have a female guide. And although 5 of the guys that day appeared unconcerned with my gender, the 6th seemed to feel his group had drawn the short straw. The 6th guy also stood out from his crew in other ways. While the others laughed together at inside jokes, spoke jovially about common friends, and were all of small to medium build. Number 6 didn't seem to get the jokes, only made negative comments, and looked like he spent all day doing upper body reps at the gym. The word steroid monkey came to mind. I gave a pre-trip briefing that steroid man barely listened to. Then we all picked up the raft and walked into the line for the put-in. A guide from another company who I'd been friends with for years made his way through the crowd. He was taller than any of my stag party crew and broader than all but steroid man. He had a dark beard, a handlebar mustache, a gruff voice, and for reasons no one could quite put their finger on, a remarkably policeman-like air. He hoisted me into a hug that left my feet dangling and asked his usual cheesy question, "How can you be so tiny on land but such a giant on the river?" He set me down, looked at my crew, and in his low, steady voice said, "You boys are lucky to have Tamar as a guide. She's one of the best. Listen up to what she says." He stared at them for a moment, letting that sink in. I'm sure my friend assumed both my size and lady parts were a disadvantage for guiding. It didn't bother me that assumption was sexist. I appreciated having friends who cared. I also thought that his telling people to pay attention to me likely did more harm than good. After all, who wants to listen to a guide who needs someone else to stand up for them? That, however, didn't bother me either. At 34 years old, I was the most confident and comfortable I had ever been in my skin. If people didn't listen to me, I had my own way to deal with it. Afloat in the big put-in eddy, I shouted out practice commands. 5 of the crew were on it, while Steroid Man paddled with all the force of a sleepy kitten. I tried to coax him into paddling in time with everyone else. We didn't need his power. I'd run good lines with 10-year-olds, but we did need to be paddling in unison. However, Steroid Man made a point of dragging his paddle and messing up the group's synchronization. That problem was exasperated by his sitting up front, as the guys behind him were supposed to follow his tempo. The good news was that his choosing to sit up front also made my plan easier. The trip leader blew his whistle. I raised my paddle along with the other guides, signaling we were ready to go. As we left the put-in eddy, and I turned our raft to hit the first wave sideways, soaking everyone on my side, including Steroid Man. He didn't appreciate it as much as the others. The next big hit was Guide's hole. If you hit the hole forward, the raft kicks up in the stern, and many guides, including myself, had at some point been tossed into the drink here. Although I generally ran it forward, as a special for Steroid Man, I spun the boat backwards and yelled, "Hang on!" Just as I guessed, everyone but him listened. A moment later, I was reaching into the river, grabbing old Steroid Man by the shoulder straps of his life jacket and yanking him in like a limp fish. He looked pissed. "I told everyone to hang on," I said in my defense. Steroid Man clambered back to his seats while the other guys laughed. Usually, a few seconds of a person's breathing holes being covered by water while their ass slammed into rocks was all it took to motivate cooperation. Steroid Man, however, wasn't so easily convinced. So, in the next rapid, he found himself accidentally out of the raft and for another swim. He wasn't happy, but his buddies found it hilarious. We neared the confluence where the rafts at the front of our company convoy had pulled over to make sure that those behind were okay to carry on. As was often the case, I was running sweep. I lifted my paddle to signal everyone could continue, but the guide who'd been in front of me waited. When I was within earshot, he asked, "Everything all right?" "Another beautiful day on the river," I replied. "Just noticing more swims than usual," he said. I gave an exaggerated shrug. "It's like someone moved the rocks on me or something." The guide smirked. We both called, "All forward," and continued on. The guy seated in the back left of my raft looked at me suspiciously. I smiled at him, wondering if he had any idea how cute he looked with his dark curls poking waywardly out from the holes in his helmet. He asked, "Have you been throwing him in on purpose?" "Would I do that?" He lifted a thick eyebrow. "I'll give you $20 for every time you get him in." I couldn't always make someone swim, but Steroid's Man's choice of seats, paired with his top-heavy build, made him an easy target. By the time we'd gone through entrance, the rapid that marks the start of the meaty part of the trip, Dark Curls said, "FYI, our little deal tops out at $100. Even Steroid Man laughed. We were growing on each other by then, and he was listening to me more. But I still got him to swim a couple more times. For old time's sake, I explained as I hauled him in.
That's great. That reminds me of a thing. I had a cabin on Gabriola, and I had a little blacksmith shop. And I used to teach little blacksmithing, beginner baby blacksmithing courses. And you could do like introductory fire poker class, which is great because all you need, I had like just a long piece of square bar, and then I'd show you how to do a twist and a split and how to flatten it and all the different little, you do 7 different techniques, and then you have a beautiful fire poker at the end. So it was really fun, and a lot of people did that. And a gal bought a couple places in the workshop for her and her husband. And my shop was only 10 feet by 10 feet, so I could only take 2 at a time. And they got there, and she's all excited. She thought it would be like a couples thing, like a bonding couples thing. And she's all excited, and he says to me, so I start giving my little safety talk and then my little talk, and he's sort of like, and I said, I just kind of waited for him to come around, and he said, "Oh, I don't need any instruction. I'm just here to use the tools." I said, "Oh, okay, well, we'll be over here then, and you can have that anvil, and you can do your thing over there. So she and I started to progress at great speed because she had all the instructor attention, and her fire poker came along very quickly, but his didn't come along at all. So it's it's hubris, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's the guy in your story in a way, right? It's
Oh yeah, totally.
so it's, but that, we're kind of joking. And earlier we were kind of having the big love in about, oh no, all the guys are awesome. Like, I get along with everybody. But in fact, yeah, okay, that's not really true. And one of the things that used to drive me completely crazy is this assumption of incompetence,
Yeah.
right? So if a young apprentice comes to his first job, there's always an assumption of competence, that he knows what he's doing until he messes up a couple of times and is proved that he's not competent. But if a woman shows up on a job, there is an assumption that she's completely incompetent until she proves over and over a number of times that she's not.
Yeah.
And if she makes a mistake, she didn't just make a mistake. Women shouldn't be here. Women shouldn't be out here. So there's my partner is a bicyclist, and I bicycle with him sometimes. And I told him the other day, it's like riding a bicycle into a headwind all the time. You know, like, it's nothing you can really put your finger on all the time, but it's like there's always just this force pushing you backwards that other people don't have that, like you know.
But these are the microaggressions that people talk about, right? And I think that's part of the journey. Is sometimes we think, and I think many of us have those experiences, these stories that there was a big thing and it had a big impact on us. But sometimes it's these small interactions where you can look at someone and you know, oh, they don't think I can do this, or they think I'm incompetent, and right away. And it's having to prove yourself. And I assume other than that experience, it's a common theme, but we get used to it as women, but it can be exhausting.
Yeah, but sometimes, like, if you're a raft guide, you actually get to deal with that in a way that you find really amusing. And make extra money for it, which is really cool.
and I think some of us find those opportunities, and maybe not in ways where people get soaked and have their bums on rocks, but where it sort of like, I guess you've got it figured out. I experience that in my job sometimes, with young people entering the industry, or young men who think, what could this person possibly have to tell me about, how to do this craft? And it's like, okay, well, go figure it out for yourself and see how that works. But it's not as fun as throwing people in water.
Interestingly, and this is one of the ways that I am seeing things changing, I learned just recently that one of the trades coordinators at BCIT is now running an apprenticeship. They've always run women in trades apprenticeship classes, exclusive classes, because women face different challenges going into a trade than young men do. But now they've responded to feedback from the students, and they're now running exclusive all men's classes, because the guys say that when they go onto a site, there's an assumption that they should know everything because they're guys, and they don't, and they feel really pressured by this. And I think that's really interesting, right? Like, he's 6'2", and he looks like whatever, he fits the stereotype. So it's like, oh yeah, you can go and do this complicated thing, and the guy's going, I don't know how to do that. So they're actually addressing that in at the trade school at the entry level, which I think is really kind of interesting.
And is that because part of it is these people entering, like, they can't communicate effectively, that they can't do it, so they need to be more prepared? Or
I think it's just kind of I think it's just part of the development training, or the part of their foundation course is how to do that, how to communicate, how to assess yourself, and how to assess other people, and how to interact with a team, like kind of all of those interpersonal skills that you can learn, right?
yeah. And that's actually a really good segue into one thing I thought about with both of you, and I think, you know, I certainly have experienced this. I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of women particularly, have experienced this. You know, when you're applying for a job or wanting to do something, start a career or enter a field, I think a lot of us women feel like we need to be excellent at things. We need to know how to do it all. You know, you hear those stories about, you know, women will only apply for jobs if they feel that they have all of the qualifications on the list, whereas men will apply for jobs when they have, you know, 20% of the qualifications and just wing it. And you both talk in detail a little bit, and so if you can share a little bit about, you know, do you think the things that you did entering into each of your fields were as extensive, or did you feel that pressure to go above and beyond to prove yourself, to be taken seriously, to do extra? Was there a tax?
Well, I think we're stumped. That's there for sure. That's a pressure that's on for sure, I would say, in the skilled trades. I didn't feel it in terms of a pressure to be better than anybody else, but I would certainly sweat it out thinking that I didn't know enough, or I didn't know how to do the thing in the beginning. Or, you know, like I would be really, really upset that if I wasn't able to meet whatever challenges were given to me. Because if you don't meet the challenge, then the bias that says you're not as good as everybody else is proven. They say, see, she's not as good as everybody else. None of them are, you know. But the great thing is that if you can stick it out, eventually you get experienced. And later, I traveled a lot. That's what this book is about. So I would go to places in the United States. And when I was in my 30s, when I could still see in that vector, when I had enough experience and my eyesight hadn't gone, I was a really good welder for about, you know, a few years, just 3 or 4 years. And that was really fun because I'd get on the crew that had to go and fix everybody else's stuff. And think, well, what's going on here? Like, this isn't right. So, you know, so then you get the opportunity to kind of invert some of the assumptions and some of the biases, right? Toss them in the water, right? The equivalent of tossing them in the water, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I put a lot of pressure on myself to be able to do things. Like, I feel like I definitely pushed myself pretty hard, feeling like, you know, I can't get away with being a half-ass guide. I've got to be able to row down the river well, and I've got to be able to set up camp well, and, you know, start fires well, and make the meals well, and I've got to, you know, like, I've got to be able to, you know, be entertaining and, like, you know, tell jokes and all this kind of stuff. And I was just like, I definitely feel like I couldn't, I wouldn't let myself slack off in any way, because I knew that, like, yeah, there's always sort of somebody watching you, waiting to be like, oh yeah, women, they just can't hold it. Right. And for me, I was really, you know, I often felt like I wasn't physically strong enough, you know, like being, I don't, like, I would imagine welding as well, like being smaller than a lot of my coworkers, like even though really what I learned was, like, you know, reading the river and being able to understand what the river does is way more important than how strong you are, but you still need a certain amount of strength. And, you know, I didn't have, and, like, you know, the stronger you are, the more you can make up for not knowing stuff. And I didn't have that strength. And that often, like, I always, throughout my whole career, I always worried about not being strong enough.
Yeah, I had that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I worked, the Boilermakers work inside confined spaces. So in industrial plants, heavy equipment, wherever there's a tank or a boiler or anywhere where you have to test the air for gas, and you have to have somebody outside making sure that you're alive and stuff. We did all the work fixing all the stuff in there. So being small was actually a benefit. So I kind of leveraged that a little bit, but I often felt as though I wasn't strong enough. So I would always try and choose sites or jobs where the stuff was so big that nobody could lift it. So then no one's going to expect you to lift a 1,000-pound thing, but if you're a good rigger, then you can do it, right? So
Yeah.
trying to be kind of cagey, trying to find the ways around the things that are the kind of obvious weakness in quotation marks, right?
Strategic.
Yes.
You have to be very
Yeah.
strategic. There is going to be an opportunity for folks to ask questions. So if you have things in mind, keep those, and that goes for folks watching on the live stream as well. But we still have a little bit of time to discuss some things, and one of the things I find interesting is the journeys from rookie to sort of experienced, in your case, guide, in your case, in the trade. Both of these memoirs take us on that journey from the early days to being experienced, and looking back and watching people then, as you are experienced, entering the craft and being able to shape other people's journeys. Going through what each of you has gone through and having these incredible journeys yourselves, what were some of the things you reflected on when you got to that stage where, hey, I'm one of the veterans or experienced people, so to speak? Was there any sort of pressure you put on yourself, or things you thought about based on the experiences you had early on?
I feel like I'm hoping I'm answering this question. I felt like as I got better, one of the things I really wanted to do was help. Like, I was really excited, at this company that I worked at, where there hadn't been any female guides before. I was so excited when we had like a new female trainee that I could if you read the book, you'll find out it didn't work out quite as I'd hoped. But I was so excited to to be able to mentor somebody and bring people in, and there was times over my career where I had women tell me what an inspiration I was and stuff. And I know it's I'm just a raft guide. I'm not saving the world or anything like that. But each of us in our own small way, it's nice to be able to change the world in whatever small way you can, and to have families come on trips and have the mothers say, you're such an inspiration to me and my daughter and stuff. It felt so good. It felt so good when it felt the Whitewater aspect of my job was obviously super exciting, but just to be able to have women feel it means something to me that to see this woman doing this job, and and I said it didn't work out, but I did have other women that I mentored and helped get into there, and it felt like such a good thing to do, when after you've worked your way up to where you feel comfortable, and then be able to share that, and it's such an amazing feeling to be able to pass that on.
Do you find that people have responded to your stories in that same way? With that kind of I found that, so I was at a launch party at a friend's house, and another Boilermaker, younger woman, said to me, I've been trying for 10 years to tell my family what I do when I'm at work, and I haven't been able to do it. But you were able to do it. So I'm buying 5 copies of your book, and I'm giving it to everybody. And
that's awesome.
Because you were talking about how meaningful it is, right? And the thing I didn't expect was this kind of outpouring from the women in trades community, who are messaging and calling. I get so much communication from people saying it's the first time I've actually felt seen in my work life, and that is really,
and from the book,
it's almost more meaningful than working on the tools. I do remember a crew when Kathy Anderson just said there were a bunch of women on this one job for one reason, and she just said, I'll take all the women, we'll do the power boiler. And so there were 7 of us, and we just crushed it. I mean, that was really fun, but it's also really rare.
Yeah.
right? It was always fun to have somebody else to bounce stuff off of. But I think your story is really important, you know? Like for the people that want to go into those areas, or who think that there's something that's physically challenging, or oh, I could never do that. You know, all the I could never do that's, and then they read your book and they go, oh, okay, right?
Well, both of your books do that.
Yeah. Yeah, but nobody wants to do what I did. Everybody wants to go on the river.
You both talked about being scared when you were kids. I'm still scared. Like when I read your book, I'm like, I still don't know that I could do it.
We're gonna take you on a blacksmithing workshop on a raft.
Great podcast.
I'd be scared of that.
I feel like
probably
that's
a terrible idea.
yeah.
Wait, really, right? Yeah.
I'll pitch
my
the
worst
podcast
ideas.
tomorrow to my boss. It's like
Like
we're
worst
on a
idea.
raft. There's some blacksmith. Yeah, it was great.
It's like some hot steel and a rubber raft. It'll be great.
What could possibly go wrong?
You got experts
Yeah,
here to
it
help
was
you.
great.
Yeah.
It was good. One of the other things I and you know, really sort of funny stories and entertaining stories in both of your books about just being in these environments with a lot of guys. And I think, you know, we all have that in our lives where, you know, where maybe we're in environments with men and women and we are a certain way and we're a certain way with our sisters and our girlfriends. But when you're in these work environments with a bunch of dudes, there's a certain way that you both described sort of showing up and being that way. And I found it interesting because I know there are a lot of conversations now about spaces, you know, we shouldn't be the ones who have to sort of adapt. The spaces should adapt to us. I mean, I have some thoughts on that and how hard that is to, you know, it's a theory and how long it takes to actually happen. But any thoughts on that and sort of how you had to be in those environments, whether it was because, you know, you felt comfortable being that way or it was a mechanism of survival or even just passing by?
So later, when I was old enough to be the mother of some of these apprentices, and they knew kind of what the tone was acceptable, they would forget that I was there because I was just another person in coveralls reading a newspaper. And sometimes they'd start talking about things like their sex life or whatever. And by the end of my career, I would just have to go, and they'd go, oh, sorry. But there's the people, right? That's one thing. Fit in with the people. But in my trade, it's something else. There's 200 years of cultural mythology that says that the demographic of the people who do this work have to be a very certain way. And people believe that. And it's a structured belief system, and there's a 200-year-old failure to include whole sections of the population in many jobs. So how does one person walk onto a job site and take that on? And when you're walking on, you don't even know that you're taking that on, you just want to pay the rent. A young woman who's going into as an iron worker to build a building, she might have a kid, you know, that she's looking at what she needs to do in her life. She doesn't know she's walking into the ground floor of the patriarchy and destabilizing the entire infrastructure of 200 years of post-industrial revolution mythology.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's tricky. My mom's 90 and has a bit of dementia. Yesterday, I went to see her, and she has a fob in her residence, and you get within 4 feet of her doorway, and her door unlatches, and the green light comes on. But she thinks that the little spy hole in the middle of the door is where you have to hold the fob up to the spy hole. So I'm like, Mom, you don't have to hold it up to the spy hole. You just have to get within the so, but she insists on leaning over a walker and holding it up to the spy hole. Then the light turns green, and it's twice I say, you don't really have to do that. You just, and then she holds it up and she says to me, "It works." And I was like, so it's kind of like that, right? It's whatever works. If it works, it works. Then I go downstairs, and there's one of her neighbors is there, and she's in her 90s, and she goes, "Oh, here, I'll open the door for you." And she waves her hand in front of the hand sanitizer because she goes like this, the door's open. I go, "Okay, thanks a lot," right? So, I mean, it's not necessarily cause and effect. It's not a conventional system, but it works. It works 100% of the time. Their system works for them. So I kind of got to like whatever it takes, if it's the dirty joke or if it's you're just on the fly. You're just on the fly all the time. Like, but I was working in groups who would gather in a small trailer, like 60 guys in a trailer for an hour, 3 times a day, or half an hour, a couple times a day, right? So, yeah, it's kind of run with that. Whereas I think you had maybe a little more room around you. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, my office was the great outdoors. I definitely didn't have to be crammed in a trailer with a whole bunch of people. Yeah, I'm just going to very briefly answer that question and say, I was pretty intimidated by the rivers and stuff, but when it came to like changing myself to fit in or whatever, I didn't really feel like I was doing that. I mean, you do it in the same way that you do with any kind of coworkers, male or female, but I didn't feel like specifically when I was with a bunch of guys, I had to act differently. I felt like a lot of times I felt like I could be relaxed and be very much myself. So yeah, it was more the river that was intimidating than like, working in that milieu.
Awesome. We have some time for some questions now, so I didn't know. Is there a microphone going? No, we're just okay. Great. So, anybody in the audience have a question for Hilary or Tamar?
Or Charmaine? She's pretty interesting.
Yeah, for me. We also have some questions from the stream. So while you are thinking, we'll go to the stream and the folks at home. And this is for both of you. What was the publishing process like, from finding an agent to revising drafts of the manuscript? Was it harder than welding and whitewater rafting?
I go for it.
Did you have an agent?
I did. Yeah, I had an agent. I was very lucky in that happened very quickly for me. The whole I wrote my book and then forgot about it I can't say I forgot about it, but I wasn't really working on it. Then, the pandemic original lockdown happened, and like everybody else, I needed a project, and I pulled it out and started thinking, oh, maybe I should find myself an agent, see if anybody's actually interested in this. And the first agent I contacted was actually interested, and she gave me a whole bunch of edits. She thought I shouldn't even say that. She gave me 3 comments about things that she wanted to change before she signed me. And 2 of them were really quickly, and the one that she thought would be no problem actually took me months to do, to the point that I thought when I finally sent it back to her that she'd be like, who is this? But no, she was interested, and she signed me, and so that process was actually pretty, it was that one edit that took me forever, that was a bit painful, but for the most part that was, pretty good. But I for some reason was under the impression that, once you have that draft that your agent likes and she sends it in and finds somebody that wants to publish it, that at that point I kind of figured, well, they're going to want to change a few things, but that's pretty much the story they want. But I don't know what the situation was like for you, but for me, I found that the editing process is in some ways a lot more challenging than running a river. Like, it wasn't just about reading and making decisions. Like, it was just like constantly, I don't know, I found that really hard, and I was changing things up to the last minute. Like when they sent me those final galleys that you're not supposed to send anything anymore, I rewrote the last chapter. I don't know. What was your experience with that?
I had written a poetry manuscript of that kind of weird poetry that I couldn't make a living at, and I made some recording projects, but I never sent it to a publisher. And then I sent it to Anvil Press because I loved Anvil Press and because they were called Anvil, and I was a blacksmith, so I was like, of course.
Kismet.
And I'd known those guys peripherally for a long time, like 30 years or something, like because we just from being in Vancouver for the same period of time. So time passed, and I kind of bugged them once in a while. And then Brian Kaufman called me up and said, let's go meet for coffee. And I said, okay. And I thought, oh, this is where he's going to sit me down and say, well, your poetry manuscript doesn't meet our catalog needs right now, but you could send it to and tell me that he wasn't going to. I had this sort of dire sense of what was going to happen. And we went to Kafka's Cafe, and he kind of wasn't getting to the point, and I was really on pins and needles. And then I reached down into my pant leg, and I pulled out this huge beetle, and I put it on the coffee table at Kafka's Cafe. And he went, no, that's weird. I said, yeah, that's really weird. And then he said, so do you want to publish a book? And I went, yeah. And then he said, do you want to publish 2 books? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, why don't you write a memoir about your time working as a welder for so long? And I went, yeah, okay. And he pulled out 2 contracts, and I signed them. And then I spent about 4 years figuring out how to do that, which was really hard. And I actually didn't start the memoir until I got away from the tools. I had to leave Boilermaking and had become an inspector. And I think I had Stockholm Syndrome for a while, and then had to get some perspective. And then in the pandemic, just kind of hammered it out in about 3 months.
That's an awesome story. Isn't that great? I love the beetle at Kafka's
Cafe. They're a great press. They're a great press. And he talked me off the ledge a couple of times. I sent him emails going, I'm not going to be able to do this. And he sent me a very eloquent email telling me that I just had to keep carving away at that big piece of marble, and then inside there was going to be this sculpture. And I have a debt of gratitude there for sure. Your press is
Douglas McIntyre.
Okay. I think I've heard of them.
Sorry, no great connection between the name. I hadn't even considered that Anvil Press. That's pretty cool.
We have a question in the audience.
So Tamara, all the places that you have rafted, what's your most favorite river?
So I'm just going to repeat the question for folks watching on the stream. So for Tamar, out of all the places that you've rafted, what's your favorite river?
I've tried to answer that so many times, and it always starts with me going, oh, well, there's like the Chilco, which is so awesome, and I talk about the Whitewater and how it goes through all these different zones, and it's so incredible, and you never see anybody out there. I said, but then, I also, even though it's such a heavily rafted river, the Hudson, it's like, there's something about it that is sort of like, well, the community on it brings so much home, and then, but then there's rafting the Colorado through the Grand Canyon is just such an amazing experience. And then I think, but the Kleene, who you probably none of you have ever heard of, but it's like this amazing river just in the coast mountains but it's really hard to access. You've got to fly in and fly out, and we had to do a heliportage in the middle. You definitely not out of the budget to do with your friends for sure, but it gets more and more beautiful every day. But also every rapid in there, you feel like you might die, so it's really scary. And I ran it, and I certainly wasn't the first guy to say that after I ran it, I was just like, man, that was the most amazing trip I've ever done, and I never want to do it again. It was so fucking scary. But I don't know. There's so many rivers that I've run that are just I don't know, they pull at my heart. There's very few rivers I've run that I can't say something amazing about if I start thinking about them. So sorry, I don't have a great answer for you. I apologize.
That was a pretty great answer, actually.
Anyone else? Right. We have one last question here from the stream. What thrills you? I mean, sounds like there was a lot of thrills in rafting, and you were chasing some thrills, but.
Yeah, that thrills me. And these days I've become. These days I work in the summers. I work as a guide, mostly trying to find grizzly bears and watch grizzly bears. And it's even though grizzly bears have this image of being like these big scary things, and I'm not saying they can't kill you. They can. I'm not trying to pretend that they're like teddy bears or anything. But for the most part, my job is pretty much watching bears like eating grass and like maybe if we're lucky feeding their young and fishing. Like the biggest torturous thing, the most scary thing you see bears do is like tear apart a fish. Most of the time I don't see it. Like occasionally you'll see them get into a big confrontation with each other, but for the most part it's pretty mellow. But as mellow as it is, having a nice encounter with a grizzly bear totally these days, it's like it really thrills me. So I spend a lot of time rowing a river that has no rapids, but there are bears there and stuff, and that these days I'm getting older, and like that's kind of a little bit nicer than a huge whitewater for me, is just is having really fun wildlife encounters.
And you?
Ooh, well, I can't compete with grizzly bears. That's pretty thrilling. I would be very thrilled. I've never seen a grizzly bear.
No?
And I would be very thrilled to see a grizzly bear.
This is our second podcast.
Okay.
Yes,
We're gonna go and we're
searching for grizzly.
Searching for grizzlies with your homemade fire pokers.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Deal. Done deal. The thing that used to thrill me at work, and it sounds kind of goofy to articulate it, I don't think I've ever said it, is to do something really, really hard, like I welded pressure joints, and they would x-ray them afterwards because they had to be perfect because they were having 24,000 pounds of steam going through them. And what would thrill me would be to make the joint, and then you go home at the end of the day, and then they x-ray it, and then come in the morning, and if it's painted red, it's bad. And if it's painted green, it passed the shot. And every time I'd come in and I'd see it was painted green, I'd be like, yes, painted green. So it's a small thrill, but
pretty awesome and important.
Well, thank you, both of you, for tonight, for these lovely books. There's an opportunity for folks to get their own copy over there, and thank you so much. I mentioned this to both of them beforehand that, I don't know, because in my world I do a lot of reading, but a lot of it is news and politics and policy, and I don't get to do a lot of reading for fun. And I tell myself that stuff's fun, but now after reading these two books, I'm like, oh, maybe there's another type of fun. I don't know that I would have grabbed either one because of just where my mind goes, and it's been just such a lovely experience for me to open my eyes to something different. So thank you to both of you, and thank you for everyone for coming tonight and watching on the live stream, and to the Vancouver Writers Fest and Vancouver Public Library for this great event. Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Another round of thank yous from me. Thank you for being here. That was wonderful to listen to you. And thank you to Kylie and the Writers Festival for curating and hosting this wonderful event. Our friends from the Book Warehouse are right there selling the book, so please go get a copy. The authors are going to be sitting on those tables over there signing copies if you want that. And before I let you go, I'm going to tell you about two upcoming events in this same stage. So next Wednesday, same time, same place, we're hosting an event about the one policy that is keeping our cities from being more livable, equitable, sustainable. Can you guess what it is? Zoning laws. So I know it sounds very dry, but it's going to be a riveting event.
Very sexy.
Yes.
Zoning.
I try to
week.
really sell it. It's a conversation with a city planner from California who's written a really interesting book about the advocating for abolishing zoning laws altogether. And he's going to be having a conversation with the urban affairs expert of our city, Francis Bula, who writes for the Globe and Mail. So that's going to be here on Wednesday. There's only 15 seats left, so please go and book your tickets as soon as possible. And then the next event, the next Incite, is here on March 22nd, and that's going to be an amazing conversation between two doctors who also happen to be novelists. So Vincent Lam and Danielle Kala will be discussing Vincent Lam's new book, new novel, which deals with the opioid epidemic, and it's a conversation about addictions. So come listen to that, please. We'll see you back here, and that's it from me now. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.